Oh, he's coming. I'm so excited. I have waited for years to see this man, and now he's coming. I know it's a big crowd, and I may only just catch a glimpse, but I don't care. I'm just so thrilled that I have the chance to see him ride by on his chariot. This is such a cool opportunity for me. They say that he's sent mysteriously by his God to help us. And honestly, that's why I look up to him, is he's done so much for our country and for everything that we stand for. I'm thrilled. I kind of hope that as I reach out when he comes by, maybe he'll stop. Wouldn't that be so neat, so cool, if he stops and asks who I am, and maybe he'll sign something, or, okay, I need to stop because I'm starting to dream a little outside of what is reality now, but I just can't tell you how excited I am. You see, this man came, and they say a lot of things about him. They say that he literally speaks for God, that God speaks to him and tells him what to tell us. Isn't that amazing? I can tell you, I've never heard from God. I've never heard his voice. So this guy must be someone special. This guy must be different in some way. They say that he is so holy, that he's so pure, that he turned down the opportunity to be with this celebrity, this really famous rich lady, and he said no. I'll tell you right now, I wouldn't have been able to say no, but he did, because he's so close to his God. They say that everywhere he goes, he changes lives. That something about him just changes and impacts the people that are around him. Can you imagine having that kind of a personality and that kind of a blessing, that the moment you come into the room, people just stop and their lives change because you're there? I have even heard that in every situation he's ever been in, that he eventually became the leader of wherever he went. They say that he even became the leader of a prison, even though he was a prisoner. Isn't that cool? I mean, I want to be like this guy. He's my role model. He's the guy that I would love to be like one of these days. And I say all this, but the truth is there's a really personal reason why I look up to him. You see, I have 2 boys and a wife, and if it wasn't for this man, my family would have starved to death. I would have had to watch my 2 sons slowly die of starvation and watch my wife suffer, and I myself would have had to suffer and go through that. But because of this man, I have food on my table. My boys eat because of what this man did. So when he comes by, I'm not just looking at him as a role model or someone that is important or impressive. I look at this man as my Savior. I look at this man as the one who took care of my family when I couldn't. This man's a big deal to me. We're looking at the story of Joseph today. So I want you to take your Bibles or your apps or whatever you read on, and I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. If you don't have a Bible with you or an app on your device, there are Bibles in the chairs. Genesis is the first book in here, so you should be able to flip just a few pages in, and you're going to look for Genesis and then a big 39. So Genesis 39 is where we're going to be this morning. Now, as you're turning there, let me kind of catch you up to where we have been. We're in a series called Empowered, and it's all about looking at the accounts of great men and women that God used and empowered to change the world. And today we're on Joseph, Genesis 39. So let me tell you what's happened between Genesis 1 and Genesis 38. So Genesis 1, God creates everything in the universe. Then Adam and Eve comes along. Of course, they stumble and sin. They're kicked out of the garden. They have 2 sons, Cain and Abel, and there's the whole mess that happens between Cain and Abel. Then sin really starts corrupting and destroying God's creation. And around Genesis chapter 7, we find out that God appoints a man named Noah to build a big boat, basically, and he's going to wipe everything out and start over. And Noah and his family are going to be the starting over point. Then we see, after the account of Noah and what happens with him and his family, we see that the world begins to populate again, and along comes a guy named Abram, who we will later know as Abraham. I preached on Abraham a few weeks ago about how his life had some ups and downs and turns and what God did through him. He has a son named Isaac, and Isaac marries a woman named Rebekah. They have 2 boys named Jacob and Esau, and Jacob ends up through some interesting circumstances becoming the inheritor, the one who receives everything and the blessing from his father Isaac. And then we come to the place where Jacob has his family. Jacob ends up having 12 sons. And that brings us to where we're at. Jacob, amongst his 12 sons, he has a son named Joseph. And Joseph is who we're going to look at today. Joseph was not the firstborn. He was actually one of the younger of the sons, but he was the firstborn of Jacob's favorite wife. And so Jacob, quite frankly, Jacob spoiled Joseph. He gave him everything he wanted. At one point, it's told to us that he gives Joseph a coat, a robe of some kind that was multicolored. Which brings us to this interesting point about this robe. Now, back in Joseph's time, clothing was very expensive, especially colored, like dyed fabrics. They were so expensive that there are multiple accounts in the Bible and outside of the Bible where it's recorded that clothes are used as currency. That's how valuable they are. If you go look, for example, in the book of Judges, Samson makes a deal with some Palestinians, and in that exchange, Samson uses 5 sets of clothing as his currency. Basically saying, hey, if I lose this bet, then I'll give you 5 sets of clothing. That's how expensive clothing was. But colored clothing was especially expensive. This robe, many Hebrew scholars, Jewish scholars, believe that this robe was actually a family robe that was passed down from father to the inherited son, the son that would receive the inheritance. And so this robe was not just some nice fancy robe or coat that Jacob had made. This is literally Jacob's symbolizing that Joseph will become the heir to his kingdom, to his empire, even though Joseph isn't the firstborn. So imagine for just a minute, if you were one of Joseph's 11 other brothers, most of which are older than Joseph, imagine seeing your dad give your younger brother, who had no rights to the inheritance, seeing your dad give him this robe of symbolism. Would you feel great about it? No. You would be angry about it. You would feel robbed. You would feel as if what was rightfully yours had been yanked away from you. And so in this situation, the coat of many colors actually means a lot more than what we understand in our English reading of Genesis, later parts of Genesis. So he gets the robe, and then something interesting happens. Joseph has 2 dreams. In the first dream, it's basically a symbolization of Joseph being some kind of ruler and his brothers bowing down to him. And then in the second dream, it's the same thing. Joseph is some kind of ruler, and all of his brothers and his mother and father are going to bow down to him. And Joseph, in his youth and immaturity, no offense, in his youth and immaturity, Joseph decides to tell this dream to his entire family. Now, think about this for a second again. Your little brother or your son, not even your oldest son who's an upper teenager. We're talking, Joseph was probably in his very early teens when all this took place. Joseph comes to you and says, hey, guess what? You're going to bow down to me. That's what Joseph is doing here. So there's a problem that we see with Joseph in this account. First off, this is all found in Genesis 37. We're not quite to 39 yet. In this account, we learn two things. And I'm going to chase this rabbit and then come back to our main point. But the first thing is this. Parents, don't spoil your children. Because Joseph, according to the writings in the Bible and the biblical commentary, the ancient Hebrew writings that talked about this part of the Bible, Hebrew scholars believed and wrote about how Joseph was arrogant and proud. That at this point in his life, he's not exactly a shining example of godliness. And so the fact is that what do we end up with when we spoil our children too much? We end up with brats, don't we? And so parents, this is a lesson. Do you want your child to be sold into slavery? Then don't spoil your kids. Just kidding. That's what happens to Joseph here in a minute. But on a serious note, don't spoil your kids. Parent them properly. Here's a harder one. Grandparents. Oh, I caught your attention for a minute, didn't I? Grandparents. It's okay to spoil your grandchildren within the boundaries that your children have set. Guys, if you're a grandparent, don't derail the work that your kids are doing in raising their children. Don't derail the development and the discipline that their parents are trying to instill in them. Spoil them great, but do it within healthy boundaries. Honor the work that your children are doing to raise your grandkids right. So, that's the first point. Second point, in the previous service, our graduates sat in on the service and listened to the message. And so my message was to the kids and especially the graduates, learn from Joseph's immaturity. There's a point here where Joseph, in his arrogance, should have gone to somebody that he looked up to and said, hey, I've had these two really weird dreams. How should I handle this? But instead, he goes and brags to his brothers and his mom and dad, and it ends up backfiring on him. And so, children, we've got a handful of kids still in here. Children, use wisdom. Young adults, use wisdom in the relationships that you have. You're surrounded by people who have a lot more experience and a lot more knowledge and wisdom than you may have. Lean into that. When you've got questions, spiritual questions, big decisions that are coming up, look to the wisdom that you may find around you. Proverbs says that those who seek wise counsel are wise themselves. So seek out and don't turn away that wise counsel. So, Joseph has the dreams, didn't handle them correctly, and he ends up getting sold into slavery by his very own brothers. His dad sends him to go check on his brothers. As they see him coming, they start plotting against him. They throw him in a pit, and they're trying to figure out what to do with him. They see a group of slave traders coming down, and they decide, we're going to sell the kid. And so they sell him to these slave traders. The slave traders, in turn, send him to Egypt to be sold to a man named Potiphar, who was somebody. He was an important figure back in this day and time. So he would be considered a celebrity, a very wealthy, well-to-do, everybody knew who he was kind of guy. And so that's where we pick up in Genesis 39. Turn to Genesis 39, verse 6. Genesis 39, starting in verse 6. And it says, coming up to this, he has been sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar is so impressed that he has put Joseph in charge of his entire household. And so that's where we pick up with in verse 6. And it says this: So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in this house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant who you brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as the master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So we find out that somewhere in Joseph's journey of life, he's grown up quite a bit. He's matured. And in this, we see that he has learned to live with integrity, no matter the situation. Integrity becomes his cornerstone. Through God, of course. That's what I mean. Now, let me define integrity, because we're going to talk a lot about integrity from this point forward. Integrity is when your actions reflect what you claim, no matter who you're around, or even if you're alone. So integrity is that behavior that's based on your beliefs, based on your values, that is consistent. It doesn't change depending on who you're with. So as a follower of Christ, we should have Christian integrity no matter whether we're with Christians or not. And so Joseph had integrity. And so here's my big idea. Here's my big statement for this morning. This is that idea that I want you to go home and think through. Here it is. Integrity is the magnet that attracts people to Jesus. Integrity is the magnet that attracts people to Jesus. You see, integrity is difficult, but it's essential. It's godly behavior in ungodly circumstances. All too many times we get caught up in difficult times or in tempting times, and we take our integrity and we put it in the back seat. And we say we don't need it anymore. But in reality, God calls us to live in integrity no matter where we're at or what we're doing. Integrity is something that Joseph valued. So think about the remainder of Joseph's story. We left off with him getting thrown in prison, and tells us that while he's in prison, the prison guards, the leaders of the prison, find out and discover that Joseph is really a guy that can be trusted. And so they end up putting him in charge of the entire prison system. They basically sit back and let him do all the work because they can trust him. And then comes these two prisoners. One used to be the cupbearer, one used to be the baker of Pharaoh. And they both have dreams, and they come and bring their dreams. And Joseph says, "Well, God told me what these dreams mean." And he gives them an interpretation. And 3 days later, exactly what he said happened, what God told him would happen, comes true. One of the guys gets sentenced to death. The other guy gets his old job back and is back with Pharaoh. Fast forward a few years, Pharaoh has a dream. He has two dreams. And no one can interpret what Pharaoh's dreams are. And so the cupbearer, in that moment, remembers, oh yeah, there was this Hebrew guy. He knew how to interpret dreams. He knew how to tell you what a dream meant because he interpreted my dream. And so he tells Pharaoh, "Pharaoh, there's this guy, and it may sound weird, but he's in prison. And he interpreted mine and the baker's dreams a few years ago, and exactly what he said was going to happen, happened." So Pharaoh sends for Joseph. So Joseph comes in. Pharaoh tells him the dreams. He foretells what the dreams mean, and then gives Pharaoh some advice. A lowly foreign prisoner is giving Pharaoh advice. But that's what he does. Basically, the dreams come out that Egypt is going to experience 7 years of plenty. So much food is going to be developed and grown that nobody could eat it in their lifetime. And that 7 years of prosperity is going to be followed by 7 years of extreme famine when not a single thing will be grown. And Joseph makes the suggestion, listen, you need to save up for those 7 years to prepare for the next 7 years. He goes, you need to put someone wise and knowledgeable in charge of storing and distributing what Egypt produces and ends up storing. And Pharaoh looks out amongst his people, his advisors, his religious sages, and he looks at them and says, is there anyone here that we can trust to do that more than this lowly Hebrew prisoner? And everybody says, nope. And so Pharaoh names Joseph the second in command over all of Egypt. The only person who has more power and authority than Joseph is Pharaoh himself. And so Joseph becomes the one who begins storing in this time of plenty and then distributing in this time of difficulty. And so he ends up providing for all of the nation of Egypt and the surrounding nations, because then 2 years into the famine, we find out that Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to buy food because there's no food where they're at. Joseph sees them, recognizes them. They don't recognize him. And he has this plot that he enacts where he tricks them and kind of plays this game so that he can get his father to come and see him as well. And when it all plays out, we get to Genesis 45. And I want you to listen to what Joseph says about why all of these things have happened to him. I want you to notice who he gives the recognition to. So I'm going to read chapter 45, verses 4 through 8. And it says this, so Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve my life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. Listen how he says in verse 8. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Isn't that amazing? In Joseph's integrity, he recognized that everything that had taken place, all the good, all the bad, was God's working. That in this circumstance, God had a purpose and a reason why he put Joseph through all of this. And so, he found favor. I've been talking about how integrity is a magnet that attracts people to Jesus. Well, look at Joseph's life. Because of Joseph's integrity and the blessing that God had on him, everybody around Joseph was impressed. Can you think about what his reputation must have been as he started gathering grain and then they hit the famine and everybody around them is starving, but the Egyptians are just fine. What do you think Joseph's reputation is? Because of his integrity and because he was willing to listen to God, God used him in a powerful way. And ultimately, we get to reap the benefit of knowing what happened with Joseph and how Joseph's story, his account, leads people to Jesus. So, why is integrity so difficult? Why is it that we struggle with integrity? And you may be sitting there, well, I don't struggle with integrity. I'm a man or I'm a woman of integrity. I keep my business straight and I live by a Christian example. I'll push back a little bit because I think every single person struggles in one way or another, even if it's a very small way. We all struggle with some form of integrity because let's face it, we're all hypocrites, aren't we? Every person who has ever been born on the face of the earth at some point has struggled with doing what they say they do. Every single person who has ever lived has struggled with saying, I believe this, and then their actions actually reflect that belief. We've all had that point. And so why is it so hard to not live as a hypocrite? Why is it so hard to live in integrity? I think it's because we live in a society that tells us there are times when there are exemptions to our integrity. I think that our society has gotten used to saying, well, in this situation, it's okay if integrity takes a back seat. In this circumstance or in this setting, you can just take your integrity and you can forget about it for just that moment and then be a person of integrity again. But does God's word ever tell us that there are exemptions to our truthfulness, our honesty, and living out our faith day in and day out? No. So, let's make it personal. I'm going to step on some toes. I know that, and I don't do this very often, but I'm just giving you a warning. I want to get this personal because we can't live as people of integrity until we come face to face with the ways that we fall short with our integrity. So let me give us a few examples. The first one, do you always live as a person of love, or are there times when you live in your selfishness? Let me give you some general examples. Every single one of us in this room, after this service at some point, are going to go get in a big metal box with windows in it and a steering wheel, right? How many of us struggle when we get into that metal cage? We struggle to love others who may cut us off, or don't drive as wise or as careful or as safely as we do. How many of us tell our integrity, listen, you need to take a back seat while I'm behind this wheel? How many of us become unloving when we get in a car? It's hard, isn't it? Because most of the time when we're in a car, we're either not under any accountability, in other words, no one's in there with us, or the person who's with us knows us so well that they agree with when we get mad at somebody on the road, right? When I'm with my wife, I'll be honest, she dives right into my lack of integrity sometimes. And then there are better times when she holds me to integrity. But the fact is people struggle to be good, godly people behind the wheel, don't we? We say things in our cars that we would never say in this room, don't we? So we need to choose integrity and love. Let me give you another example. When someone is radically different than you are, maybe in looks or in behavior or in lifestyle, whatever it may be, how do you love people who are radically different than you? I have a little brother who is 9 years younger than I am. He lives back in Texas, where my family's from, and he spent his young adult years traveling with a Christian rock band. He thought he was going to be the next big bass player in this famous Christian rock band. It never took off. But in his travels, he acquired many, many tattoos. Many tattoos, I mean by saying from his second knuckle all the way up to his neck, all the way down to the tops of his feet, are covered in tattoos. I think there are only a handful of square inches on his entire body that doesn't have a tattoo on it. He has big gauged out ears, meaning he's got those ears that are stretched out and they put discs in them. He's got those in his ears. Like, he doesn't look like your typical conservative Christian American, right? He looks different. Here's why I bring this up. In the small town where my brother lives, he's not welcome to come to church unless he covers everything. That's not integrity, people. That's hypocrisy. Because did Jesus ever push someone away because of the way they looked? No. But guys, I would challenge you, every single one of us has a type of person that we are uncomfortable with, and we would rather push away than embrace with the love of Jesus, don't we? I've got tattoos. I don't have a problem with people with tattoos. I have problems with people that never smile. I would rather just avoid you altogether if I've never seen a smile on your face. But the fact is we all struggle with some type of person to be loving to them in the name of Jesus. What about when you're on the phone with a customer service person trying to get something fixed that's not working? And you've been on the phone for 45 minutes on hold, listening to elevator music over and over and over and over and over. And then the customer service person comes on and they have an accent that doesn't quite sound Texan. and you say to yourself, this angers me, and you take your integrity and you put it in the back seat because in the moment you would rather unload to this person rather than maintain godly integrity. There's so many ways that we struggle to maintain our integrity. Let me give you another example. Do we tend to be more generous or do we tend to be more greedy when it comes to God's blessings in our life? Let me give you a great example. When I was in high school, I had this friend named Kim. We went to high school together. We ran in the same circles. And me and one of my best friends named Jeremy were constantly inviting her to church. But there was one problem. She worked at a local Mexican restaurant, and she usually worked the Sunday lunch shift. And one day, Kim looks at me. I had invited her to come to youth group one night. And Kim looks at me, and she said these words, Chad, I'm not going to come to your church. I'm not interested in that. She goes, because I don't like Christians. And then she went on to tell me how it was a common belief amongst servers at restaurants that the lunch crowd on Sunday was the highest demanding crowd, the least easy to satisfy, and the stingiest with their tips. What kind of witness are we presenting to the world when we are more concerned with our own personal satisfaction with service and greed than we are with loving someone generously who may need a leg up? You don't know what that server's been through that day. You don't know what that server's been through in the last week or month. You don't know what demands that her boss or his boss has placed on them in that moment. Don't tip for service, tip for Jesus. Show those services. If you're going to pray at the table before your meal, you better show that server the love of Jesus with your tip. If you don't bother praying. Don't bother saying that you came from church. Go back home, throw on a stingy t-shirt and shorts so you don't look like you just came from church. Then go and eat and leave a cruddy tip. But don't you dare claim to be a Christian and then insult someone by not tipping them well. Be generous with what you give. Lastly, truth or manipulation. When it comes to integrity, which do you live in? Let me give you some examples of what I mean. We live in a culture that is very much online. It's on the internet now. And we have two different behaviors. We have face-to-face behavior. We have a way that we act when we are interacting face-to-face with someone. And we have certain standards and boundaries that we don't ever cross when we're face-to-face with people. And then we have a different person that we present ourselves as online. That there are no boundaries. And there's no level of hate that we won't spew while typing on a keyboard or punching away on a device. I guarantee you, all of the people who know you online know that you're a Christian and they're paying attention to what you're saying. And when you type something that is hateful or slanderous to another person, do you think the people who don't know Jesus, who are paying attention to you, do you think that they see those posts and go, you know what? I love what I'm seeing here. I want what they have. No. When we hurt people online, and what I mean by that is when we slander someone because we disagree with them, I don't care what political party you support, no one, by God's standards, deserves to be trashed online. If you're online and you're sharing every picture of some politician or activist or whatever, and you're saying mean, hateful things about them, you have no right calling yourself a Christian if you put that stuff online. Is there any person that Jesus says, oh, well, as long as they're a political opponent, you can say whatever you want about them? No. As a matter of fact, Jesus says we're to pray for our enemies and love them. Paul says that we're supposed to be kind to them so that we heap burning coals on their heads. So why is it that in our online culture, we just tear people apart and then claim to be a Christian? It's not right. If that's the area that your integrity takes a back seat, maybe you need to just stay offline. Maybe you need to avoid being on your device or your computer. I've stepped on toes. I know that. I know that I've hurt feelings and I've probably confronted some difficult situations. I know that. But the fact is it can't go unsaid. The Bible calls us to it. Joseph is a living example of how we can change the lives around us if we live what we say we believe. And when we don't live what we say we believe, we become a repellent to Jesus. People are pushed away when we don't act the way we say we believe. But when we act like Christ calls us to in the Bible, people are attracted. We become a magnet in the name of Jesus. We cannot represent Jesus well unless we reflect his integrity and character. So what is Jesus challenging you on this morning? What area of integrity do you need to work on? Will you join me in prayer?